And then writer's block shut down. And we thought, holy shit, this is a real 1-2 punch. Man, this is Buster Douglas hitting Tyson, you know? It was bam, bam, and suddenly these two support columns for a lot of Columbus poetry went off to do other things. So I'm glad that things are coming up in their wake. It's real. It's new. There are a number of new readings, and we'll see how they evolve and what audiences they develop, and that's important for the time.
So, because Cauldron very much seems to be, like you said, stage. Do you know of any kind of page replacement to Forum that has or is trying to arise?
I'm not familiar with anything that is going to be that appears it's going to be a regular series. There are any number of places that have readings occasionally. I mean, Peripatetic Poets, it decamped to Cincinnati. Someone in Cincinnati took it over, and now Peripatetic Poets is in Cincinnati. And they were another reading. They called themselves Peripatetic because they could never hold on to a venue. They'd be in one venue for a couple of months, and then, you know, whatever the bookstore was or whatever, would say, oh, no, you know, this isn't paying off for us, you know, because stores count when they're hosting things like that. They have kind of a formula, you know, which is, okay, for every person for something like that, we should be selling 2 books. And if on the nights those things aren't happening, we're not selling X number of books times the number of people in the room. This is not productive for us. It's a business. I get it. But, you know, they were there, they were then we were at a coffee house, then they were at a church, you know, they just moved all around. And that was largely a page-based reading. It never garnered a really large audience, but it had a loyal audience. Right now, I don't know of anything like the Poetry Forum. Now, there's a reading that started up at Bossy Girls, which is on Monday nights now. And it basically is about bringing the works of a particular dead poet, a past poet, and reading that person's works and then having an open mic behind that. So people can bring in the works of, you know, William Stafford, or bring in the works of Philip Levine or Anna Akhmatova, or whatever poet they name for the week. And they do that for, you know, 40, 45 minutes and let people read these other people's works, and kind of like a small lecture series or something like that. I haven't been to it yet, simply because I'm just going to let myself not do anything on Monday nights for a while. I'm hoping that that happens, but it's a lot of energy. It's a lot of time. Unless somebody has some kind of burning fire in the gut that says, I want to do this, this is really important. That kind of a reading can't sustain itself. You know, if you can charge a door fee, you can keep something running. If you don't have that, if the venue doesn't allow for that kind of control of a space, it's a lot more difficult to make it worth your while.
That makes sense too. And I really appreciate the passing the hat concept, and the way, I don't know, that's a very clever kind of way of getting around that problem. The fact that you can't control
what you can. Well, and especially if you've established yourself, you know, you open an account at a bank that's an adjunct to your own account in a bank. If you've got a checking or a savings account, you go down to the bank and you open another account, and money starts flowing through that. Now, different banks have different requirements for that stuff. You have to have a total account relationship of X thousand dollars or something for some banks. I don't know what others are, but you could do it through a credit union or something, which doesn't have those kinds of minimums. And then you get a Square reader and you tell people, hey, we'll take your credit card. And one of the things about credit cards is that, as with any spending on a credit card, people tend to spend more than they would if it was cash passing out of their palm. The person who would have given you $1 will give you $2 or $3. The person who would have given you $2 gives you $5. And so having that works really well. So that proved successful for us. And I think, again, with some creativity, any other reading series could do that kind of thing. But as Poetry Cauldron is finding out, and I think whatever this other reading is called, and I don't know what it is, it takes some time to develop, okay, what is this thing that we're doing? What shape is it going to take? What audience are we trying to draw? What kind of presentations are we going to be giving people? And that takes time, and build an audience slowly. The Poetry Forum sometimes had 14 people in it, and other times it had 40 people in it. And so it came and it went. The one advantage that we had is that in the open mics, I remember that one poet in particular, when she first read in the open mic, I was the MC, and I just put a star next to her name. I said, she's going to be a featured reader. That woman's got some chops. And she has gone on to great things. So it's those kinds of things that open mics, and again, if you're operating at a critical level with your audience, rather than simply saying, okay, let's applaud the poet, not the poem. And my idea is, that's like saying, if the band sucks, you're going to applaud for them. No, just because they're the band doesn't mean you applaud for them. If it's not a good song, you don't applaud for it the same way that you do for a good song. So I understand how writer's block had that particular characteristic to it. It's not one I subscribe to. It's encouraging for people, but again, I was working with a very different reading and a different audience.
And this is very personal opinion here, because I love Cauldron. I do appreciate the support. I do wish that I personally could get more feedback on things, but that's also because I, again, am not in the community enough, and I'm not quite sure how to look for that, but I'm going to do that. But something I've noticed at Cauldron, because it's very supportive, but I'm starting to notice you can tell from the type of applause whether or not there's appreciation or criticism.
Poems that pander really work.
That's
if you're pandering to an audience's biases or expectations or worldviews, that works really well. And if you're entertaining them, works really well. If you're doing something that's a little more complex, a little more thoughtful, something that that doesn't work on first hearing, that it's going to be different. And you've really touched on something that's important, and it's finding a group to work with on your writing. I can't overstate how important that is. Years back, I got together with a couple of friends of mine, and one was kind of a political commentary guy, and the other one was a fiction writer, and I was a poet, and there was another poet, and there were a couple, but that didn't work out. And then I got together with, this is probably in the early 90s or so, I was hanging out with like 6 other poets whose work I found valuable and liked, and who I trusted to kick my shins if they needed kicking, and not to let that get to me. And if you have that combination of trust and critical ability from the people you're sitting down with, that can really, really be helpful. But that's hard to find. And I think one way to find that is that you watch these other people, and if there's something that in any way captures something that you're working even generally in the same vein as, say, hey, would you like to get together once a month or every 2 weeks for like 2 hours in the evening, and we'll exchange poems and punch them up a bit and shape them and help each other out. You can't beat that. Can't beat that combination of trust, both in the people, but also in their ability and their willingness to criticize you and push you. That's hard to find because a lot of people simply want strokes, and nothing wrong with wanting strokes, but it doesn't improve your poetry.
No, it does not. And I think that's kind of something. And I do think it is nice to have that, that's very nice, dear. That was a great poem. And, and a lot of the poets that I know are very anxious, very self conscious. And that's including me. But something it's kind of happened to me that I hope, any future poets who have that anxiety or that fear of criticism is that after about my second or third month with the Cauldron, reading poetry and getting that supportive feedback, I found myself craving, like, no, I want you to drag me, to criticize me, be brutal.
Don't
please.
patronize me.
Yeah.
Don't patronize me.
I hope we can see more of those types of groups pop up. I think that would be very, very
well. I think that's the place you want to find them. Is that you look at someone, you say, well, this person seems to want to be a little more serious about their work rather than simply saying, I need to get something off my chest. I need to tell you what I think. Well, okay, those are fine things. But if you're talking about craft, there's something else. And a lot of times, if people are just giving you strokes, that doesn't help you get any better. If you go to, if you're trying to be a painter, as an artist, and you're slopping paint on the canvas, and somebody comes up, oh, that's really good. Well, how are you ever going to get any better? You're just going to keep doing what you do. If somebody says, what the hell are you trying to communicate here? I mean, you've got this, you seem to have a good sense of form, but what the hell is this thing trying to do? Those are the kinds of things you want in a poetry group.
I like that. That's also a question I need to keep asking myself, because you get lost within the work of the creation process, no matter how good or bad it is. And that's something that I forget to ask myself is, what am I trying to convey? And that's what I'll do with a lot of my edits. I'll shut them away for 6 months, come back and ask myself that same question. What am I trying to convey?
And that's a good practice. Just, put them aside and let them sit there, and then come back to them fresh, where you're not in the moment, in the emotion of what generated the poem, or at least got the poem started, and you can look at it with kind of a cold eye. The Richard Hugo wrote a wonderful book called The Triggering Town, and it's basically it's a very nice little collection of essays, and it's about how, well, the thing that initiates the poem isn't necessarily what the poem's about. And so it was the idea of you're driving down a highway and you see a little town with its, and it's evening and you see the lights on out there, and it makes you think of something maybe about a town or what might be that town. But you don't end up writing about the town. You end up writing about that thing that jump-started your idea. And so that idea of the thing that got me to write this may not be, could be, likely isn't what the poem's really about.
So regarding the whole poetry community and, an outsider who might be listening to this, who's not familiar with the poetry community and maybe assumes that it's very academic and gatekeepy, you had told us a couple stories. Would you be willing to tell those again?
Sure. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was very vague.
Just
the raucousness that can happen within the poetry community. I've learned a little bit about
yeah, well, and again, it was a very different time. But when the poetry forum started out, we were building something out of nothing. We didn't even know exactly what we were building, except, okay, we're going to have some people read poetry every Monday night, and one person's going to get to read a lot and everybody else is going to get to read a little, and that was that. So it was sometimes the MC would sit in a booth just to the side of where the microphone was, and be sitting there, and you'd say, okay, it's 2 poems or 5 minutes, and somebody would finish that second poem and start a third, and you'd have to say, nope, 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 nope. I don't know if people thought we were just going to say, well, if I just start my poem, it'll be okay. And some people have no sense of time, and we weren't dealing with this at that time, but I used to joke, okay, we set it up as 2 poems or 5 minutes. Otherwise, somebody's going to get up there and read a haiku and then read Whitman's Song of the Open Road. And we're going to be there until 11:30. So we said 2 poems or 5 minutes, whichever comes first. And the poetry community, even now, had its little cliques and clacks within it. And it was a lot of younger people, mostly people in their 20s. And there's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of passion, and there's a lot of intimacy in all kinds of forms in those groups. And we had to finally, one night, somebody got up and started reading a poem, and it became clear that the poem was talking about someone sitting in the audience whom the poet at the mic was part of, who had beaten up his girlfriend. And the person at the mic was doing a poem that was basically attacking that person. And the guy jumped up and ran forward, and he was going to clock him, and so we had to jump up and separate the two of them. And then we had the rule that said, you cannot attack members of the audience from the microphone. You cannot direct your poems at a member of the audience from the microphone. And the only way, actually, there were exceptions to that. And one of them was the night that one of the poets, who was very much, this is a guy who'd been 101st Airborne. He'd been homeless. He had lots of tattoos. He was really rough cut, but really, really had a good sense of poetry. And he'd been coming for a while, and this other young woman had been coming for a while, and they'd kind of connected. And he walked away from the microphone, and he's just doing his poem, and he goes down on one knee in front of her and asks her to marry him. And the place just blew up, and it was just one of those nights. Man, you can't script this stuff. Yeah, that was a treat. So there were those kinds of things. There was another night much later at Larry's where some guy got up in the open mic and started to read this poem that I first thought was just this kind of badly written erotica. And it got a little farther in, and all of a sudden it clicked on me. I said, my God, this is a rape fantasy. And I just started booing, really loud. I wasn't the MC that night. And I was just standing over at the bar, and I just started booing and booing and just shouting at him, get off the mic, take that shit out in the alley. And a number of other people started booing, and the guy finally just stopped and walked away from the microphone. There's some things you can't do,
Because it makes sense, especially, after I learned a little bit more about slam and why slam, like on a national stage, went away. It makes sense. You're going to have bad actors, malicious poets, for lack of a better word. But the idea of it, for some reason, until you tell me the story, and that's interesting, and that's almost unfortunate. I'm glad that you did that.
No, some ship will not wash. That kind of thing. I'm sorry, we were in the 2000s at that point. You don't get to do that kind of crap.
Oh, wait. So this was this century that this happened?
It might have been the late 90s, but it was might have been, yeah, it was late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah. Oh, this wasn't back in the 1980s. No, this was much later.
That blows my mind.
It was probably late 90s. I think we'd probably been going about 15 years.
Wow.
And all kinds of people would get up and read things from the mic. And again, you have to have, because open mics, because of their very nature, there has to be a lot of leeway in them, because people are often working out very personal things. They're testing themselves in terms of both an art and their own sense of expression. You got to give a lot of leeway. On the other hand, when you talked about, the demise of slam years ago, and this is not about any particular reading, but I wanted to support I would go to some poetry slams. I was not a big slam fan. I once won a slam up at the Theodore Retke Poetry Festival in Michigan because I figured out really early I hadn't signed up to be in the slam, but the first two people who were up there didn't seem to understand that you have to entertain the audience. They were reading poems. And I said, no, 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 no. You've got to get something that's going to either enrage or entertain the audience. And so I trotted out three of my poems that I knew were keepers that way, that had punchlines at the end or something like that, or that were just rants that were amusing just in their excess. But yeah, in a slam, you let that go. So I it was the Women of the World Poetry Slam. And, and I sat through a number of the sessions. And near the end, they had one big reading. And at a certain point, I don't remember who it was with. I don't know. It might have been Louise Robertson. I said, I got to go. I'm feeling like I've been beaten. I can't listen to another "My Daddy Was Awful" poem. I just can't listen to another one. That's nothing about the individual poems. It's just, I'm just tired. And that was that.
That's kind of a really interesting point too, though. Yeah, if you hear the same theme over and over, it's going to get boring, no matter how good or bad the poem is. It's just going to get boring because you've heard this, you've heard this, you've heard this. It's an aspect I hadn't thought of, and I know, like I said, I know slam on a national level has gone away. I've heard so many whispers about slam competitions just in my little time here that it's, and then Meat Grinder's coming back in 2024. So I'm so excited for that, just to see even a sliver of what this was all about. So that's something I'm going to keep in mind too, and try and maybe have a few different types of poems that are hopefully not the same as what everyone else is.
Yeah, I think you want Robert Bly once said, you need to read any poem 3 times. And he says, the first reading should hit you in the gut or slightly below. The second reading should hit you up in your chest, where you're actually getting into the language and the rhythms of it. Only on the third reading do you get above the neck. And I think if you hit people either on their funny bones or between their legs, you're going to entertain some people in a slam. But there are also the more cerebral ones that can be either funny or very touching because they capture a common experience in a unique way or in a special way. That thing about the same poem over and over. I remember one night, it's the only night I left a reading at Poetry in the Park. There was a young woman reading, and she was a social worker who worked with abused kids. And her first poem was about that. Second poem was about that. Third poem was about that. And she started a fourth one, and I just leaned over to the person next to me. I said, I can't keep doing this. I can't do any more. The first two I could ride with, they were powerful. Now I'm just feeling like I'm being beaten up. There was no variety in the voice. And that was that.
No, I can see that. Something I appreciate about the Cauldron is that you can have an entire night of sad poetry, of just soul crushing poetry, but because of the way the MCs work and the way it creates that same variation, it also gives that counterpunch, makes the funny funnier, makes the sad sadder.
Yeah, it's a pacing of a reading. An MC makes a difference.
Oof, 4 in a row. That oof.
This is one, God, I wrote this way back. It still has so many dimensions to it that, I could probably keep analyzing it in different forms for the next several years. But, and it's called How We Sing. When we were born, our mothers heard it. Like an old story, the lyric is repeated, the line folding back on itself, elusive as an echo. Every time we love, And even as a sad curtain darkens the final frame of the window, it is there, the sweet sigh of something entering or leaving us. The long journey of the heart, even the one that never moves, forms a moonlight crescent, the line's intangible gap shrinking or growing. Beneath it, we know wherever we're going home. There's a place where we wish, without believing, this piece of sky would reflect a part of us. How we sing when someone touches that part. You touch me the way an autumn leaf sets the sky afire. Now, I don't even remember what the impetus for this was. It was related to a loss, a death in some way, but it was also about these things that exist beyond us, these things that are ineffable. And this is a poem that surprised me. You know, this poem just kind of unfolded and kind of moved itself along really nicely. I mean, you know, and it starts out, you know, as, oh yeah, it's a song. You know, when we were born, our mothers heard it. And then the lyric is repeated. Every time we love, you know, it is there, the sweet sigh of something entering or leaving us. You know, well, you want to read that as erotic, you want to read that as lost. I can't really say, you know. And the long journey of the heart, even the one that never moves. Well, is that life? Is that relationship? Is that some particular event? And then it's wherever we're going home. And there's a place where we wish, without believing, that this piece of sky would reflect a part of us. And then at the end, it comes off like a love poem, like a poem of appreciation for someone important in your life. It's a poem I could, you know, I've never sat down and analyzed it the way I've sat down with, you know, Jeff Anderson when he's bringing his library group together to look at a particular poem and everyone talk about what they find in the poem, which I love doing that. So I like poems that surprise me. Only rarely do I know what the last line in a poem is early in the poem. And a lot of it was just letting go. It was trying not to describe something specific. And I think that's something that many developing poets could benefit from. Getting outside of themselves, of looking out into the world. Don't tell me, don't interpret something out there for me. Describe it to me in such a way that I feel what it is you're feeling. You know, so don't tell me an angry man stood in the door. No, a large man stood in the door, grinding his teeth and clenching and unclenching his fists. Okay, I'm getting it. Don't tell me he was angry. And so I have a poem called Slam, which plays two ways, which is kind of in the style of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's I Am Waiting from his first collection, Coney Island of the Mind. And it has this refrain in it, and it's social commentary, and it's some of it's humor and some of it's political. I am waiting for this and this, and I am waiting for this and this, and I am waiting perpetually and forever, a rebirth of wonder. And that keeps getting repeated in the poem. And I'm going to read this one for Vernell because I read it once at a reading at Columbus State, and she jumped up and applauded. And I thought, okay, that's going to work. Now, I read it once in Cleveland, and I felt the room flinch at a particular line and said, you better go back and work on that line. You didn't want that reaction. You didn't want, you know, to make it hurt. You wanted to make it, you wanted people to feel it. You didn't want to make it hurt. But the poem starts out, at the Poetry Slam, I am waiting for a poem that does not begin with I, you know, and that's how it starts, you know, and that one's, it's fun, you know.
I'm down for that. Anything that makes Vernell, that was, yes. When the person that you respect Like, okay,
You
this
can't
is a
beat that.
good
You know?
poem. No,
You
you
can't buy
can't.
it. I'm saving it for my reading on the 11th at Rhapsody and Refrain.
So we were talking about that, the poem you're going to read, which I am pumped for now. Made Vernell jump up, and she loved it. So
Well, I'm gonna say that I'm reading it for Vernell. So
I like that. My question is, so what was that thing that made you be able to look at your work and say, yeah, this is good. I'm happy with this.
Marvin Bell wrote a whole series of little sayings, watchwords, aphorisms about poetry, and one of them is prose because of what it includes, poetry is poetry because of what it leaves out. And some poems people don't want to leave anything out, and it's just I have to keep going back and say, well, what can I give the reader that isn't saying, okay, here's your GPS, you're going to go from here to there. No, you're going to try to get somewhere out there, and I'm going to take you on a little bit of a trip, and then you're on your own. Another one he says is, the I in the poem is not you, but someone who knows a lot about you. That's a way I try to approach poetry as well, which is you don't have to talk about what you actually did. You can talk about what you felt, what you thought, what was going on inside you that really can't be done, as Marvin Bell says also. What people say there are no words for, that's what poetry is for. And so you use words to get beyond words. And so there are those kinds of things. And for me, it's mostly that balancing of, have you said enough? But more commonly, have you said too much? You don't have to say everything. And that's, again, one of those advantages of the page, which is the reader can stop at any point, go back, or the reader can finish the poem and sit, as you said, and think about it, and reflect on it, and then go back and read it again. And, that kind of Robert Bly thing of seeing, okay, the gut feeling, then the breath and the rhythm, then starting something toward quote unquote meaning. And that's why poetry groups are good, because they can catch those things that we find ourselves falling into, where we're saying things we really don't have to say. I mean, it's kind of redundancies of a sort. I mean, with younger poets, it would be, I raised the window up. No, you raised the window. When you raise something, it goes up. Or I ran into a hard brick wall. No, brick walls are by nature hard. Jennifer Bosveld had a great one, that exercise that I still use, which is, okay, when you think a poem's working, get yourself a highlighter and go through the poem and highlight every adjective. And if there's too much of that color on the page, you're probably using too many adjectives. And that goes back to William Carlos Williams' idea of no ideas, but in things. Tell us about the object the way haiku does, and then give us enough other information that we see that thing in some other way.
And I'm going to try and use the taking out the adjectives, because
I still do it. I don't have to highlight anymore. It's just I look and say, okay, an adjective here, yes, but do you really need that one? Or is you just being ham-handed, and trying to beat the reader over the head with a rolled up magazine and say, do you get it? Do you get it? So
I laugh because I do that. And I can see it, like we talked about. 6 months later, I come back to it like, ooh, I've taken a lot of your time. I think I am so grateful that you have been here with me today, given everything else that has gone on.
That you gave me the opportunity, because when people ask questions like this, it forces me to kind of find words to express what it is that I haven't been using words for, and so to kind of explain things to myself.
All right. Thank you, sir, so much.
All right. Be well.
You too.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you again for joining us today on Poems and Potions. As always, a very special thank you to Steve Abbott for being with us, and a special thank you to you, the listener, for being with us as well and helping to support us. Poems and Potions is produced by Mandar Kath, Marquita Byers, and R. Taryn Lear. Music provided by Charity Dietrich. Sound support provided by A.D. Dietrich. We hope that you'll tune in next time when we will be speaking with Karen Scott. I'm very excited about that interview, and I hope that you are too. Until then, like Steve said, be well. Bye-bye.